The human battleship that ended 1,000 empires. The signal came in at 0347 station time, and it did not ask permission. Admiral Kale Vren of the Sovereign Hegemony Battle Fleet had been asleep for exactly 90 minutes when his command console screamed at a frequency reserved for one category of event. Not an enemy fleet, not a treaty violation. The frequency was older than that. It was the frequency his predecessors had programmed into every hegemony warship 300 years ago, when the hegemony was young and afraid of things it had not yet learned to control. It was the frequency for unknown contact. He was on the bridge in 4 minutes, still pulling his uniform straight, and the first thing he saw was the faces of his crew. He had commanded the HSS Dominion for 6 years. He knew every expression his people wore in every condition. He knew what fear looked like on a hegemony bridge crew. What he saw on their faces was not fear. It was something that had no name in the hegemony's military vocabulary, because the hegemony had never needed a word for it. "Report," he said. Lieutenant Dara Fenn, his senior sensor operator, pulled up the main display without turning around. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not. "Single vessel, Admiral. Dropped out of fold space 11 minutes ago at bearing 274 by -31. No prior signature. No approach warning. It just appeared." Vren looked at the display. The shape on it was wrong in a way he could not immediately organize into a coherent thought. Too large. Too dense. The hull readings were inconsistent in ways that should not be physically possible for a vessel traveling at fold space velocities. "Classification? None on record, sir. Origin?" Fenn finally turned around. In 6 years he had never seen that expression on her face. "Human, sir. The vessel is broadcasting a standard human naval identifier. United Earth Naval Command. The ship is designated the Enduring Principle." The bridge went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them is processing the same information and arriving at the same place, and not yet ready to say what that place is out loud. Vren knew about humans. Every senior hegemony officer knew about humans. They were a relatively young species, barely 3 centuries into space travel, occupying a small cluster of systems in a region the hegemony had assessed as strategically marginal. They had been watched, catalogued, and assigned a projected timeline for integration into the hegemony's administrative structure. The projection was comfortable. Humans were capable, but contained. Their technology was developing along predictable lines. Their military capacity was adequate for local defense, but not for anything larger. That assessment had been filed 18 months ago. The thing on the display in front of him was not adequately described by any part of that assessment. "Get me a full reading on that vessel," he said. The numbers came back in 30 seconds. Vren looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at them again, because the first look had produced a result that he was not prepared to accept as accurate. The Enduring Principle massed more than any vessel the hegemony had ever built. More than any vessel the hegemony had ever catalogued in any species inventory. It was not large in the aesthetic sense, not the kind of large that was designed to impress, all sweeping lines and visible power. It was large in the way that mountains are large, dense and absolute. The hull plating was thick in a way that suggested the people who built it were not confident the universe would be gentle with it, and had prepared accordingly. The weapons systems were not visible from the exterior. This was the detail that stopped Vren completely. Every military vessel he had ever encountered displayed its weapons in some form. Placement, configuration, the external architecture of targeting and delivery. Weapons were partly functional and partly communicative. You showed what you had because showing what you had was part of the language of military presence. You wanted the other party to see it, and calculate, and arrive at the correct conclusion about the balance of the situation. The Enduring Principle showed nothing, which meant either it had no weapons, or it had no need to show them. Vren had been in the hegemony fleet for 31 years. He had fought 6 campaigns. He had negotiated the terms of absorption for 4 civilizations. He had a very precise sense for which of those 2 options was more likely, and the sense he was getting right now was not the comfortable one. "Open a channel," he said. The channel opened. Standard diplomatic frequency, the universal address that all space-traveling civilizations had long ago agreed to use for first communications, because the alternative was spending the first hours of contact arguing about which frequency to use, and that particular argument had already been had enough times to have become tiresome. Vren straightened in his command chair. He composed his face into the expression appropriate for speaking to a representative of a lesser civilization from a position of reasonable authority. He had done this before. He was good at it. Vessel designating itself as the Enduring Principle. This is Admiral Cale Vren, of the Sovereign Hegemony Battle Fleet, aboard the HSS Dominion. You are operating in Hegemony-administered space, without authorization. Please identify your commanding officer and state your purpose. Be advised that this region is under active hegemony jurisdiction, and all vessels are subject to hegemony protocols. The response came back in 4 seconds. The voice was male, human. It had the particular quality of someone who had been awake for a very long time, and had long since moved past the stage where tiredness was an obstacle, and arrived somewhere on the other side of it, where tiredness was simply the medium in which everything happened. Admiral Vren, this is Captain Edmund Cole, United Earth Naval Command, commanding officer of the CNS Enduring Principle. We are aware of hegemony jurisdiction claims in this region. We are also aware that those jurisdiction claims include 37 inhabited systems whose populations have not consented to hegemony administration. We are here to discuss that discrepancy. We would prefer to do this formally. We are prepared to do it any way that becomes necessary. Vren had prepared for many possible responses. He had prepared for demands and protests and the various diplomatic performances that junior civilizations produce when they have a grievance and have finally gathered the confidence to state it. He had not prepared for that specific sentence. He was particularly unprepared for the last part of it. We are prepared to do it any way that becomes necessary. Captain Cole, Vren said, keeping his voice level in the way that years of command had made second nature. You are one vessel. You are currently in the operational range of 7 hegemony fleet installations. I would encourage you to reflect on your position before making statements that could be interpreted as threatening. A pause of exactly 3 seconds. Admiral, with respect, I am aware of your 7 fleet installations. I know their positions, their response times, their weapon capacities, and the order in which they would be able to reach our current location. We calculated all of this before we entered the system. I mention this not to threaten you, but to make clear that our presence here is not accidental, and our request for formal discussion is not desperate. We simply have things to say. It would be in everyone's interest to hear them. Vren turned off the channel. He looked at the display for a moment. Then he looked at the sensor readings again, the ones that showed a ship of impossible mass with no visible weapons, sitting in his space like it had always been there, and had no intention of being anywhere else. He turned to his communications officer. Get me Fleet Command, Priority 1, and get me everything we have on the Enduring Principle. Everything. The communications officer opened her mouth, and then closed it again. Vren raised an eyebrow. Sir, she said carefully, we have already queried the database. There is nothing in any hegemony record on a vessel by that name. It does not appear in any human naval inventory we have on file. As far as our records show, this ship does not exist. Vren looked at the display again. The impossible ship sat in his space and said nothing and waited. It exists, he said. He had 3 people in his crew, with the clearance to access the deeper intelligence files, the ones that the hegemony maintained on civilizations it was monitoring for integration. He pulled those files himself, standing at his own console in the middle of his bridge, scrolling through the assessments of human military capability that his intelligence division had compiled over the past decade. Adequate local defense. Developing technology on predicted lines. No indication of capability beyond home system projection. Integration timeline. 40 to 60 years depending on voluntary cooperation rate. He looked at the ship on his display. He looked at the date stamp on the intelligence assessment. 18 months. Something had happened in the last 18 months that the hegemony's intelligence apparatus had entirely missed. And whatever it was currently sitting in his space, asking for a formal conversation. His senior tactical officer, a careful man named Lieutenant Commander Piers Oak, came to stand beside him without being summoned. Oak had been with him for 4 campaigns. He was not the kind of officer who came to stand beside you unless he had something to say that he did not want the rest of the bridge to hear. Sir, Oak said quietly, the fold space entry. I have been running the calculations since the ship arrived. And? Oak looked at the display. He looked at it for a moment, with an expression that Vren had never seen on him before, and Piers Oak was a man who had seen a great deal. To enter fold space at that precise point, from wherever they originated, they would have needed to calculate the gravitational variables of this entire system, down to a precision that our best navigation teams could not achieve with direct sensor access. They did it from outside the system, without direct access, and they arrived within 40 meters of their intended position. Vren said nothing. 40 meters, sir. In fold space transit. Our own vessels, with full sensor support, with complete local data, cannot achieve that kind of entry precision within 1,000 meters. Whatever guidance system they used to get here, we do not have an equivalent. Vren still said nothing. Oak lowered his voice further. And sir, the fuel expenditure for a vessel that size, at the speed implied by their transit time from human space, should have been enough to power a small planet for a decade. They did it in what appears to be a single continuous fold. We have no record of any civilization achieving continuous fold space transit at that mass. Vren looked at the display for a long time. The enduring principle sat there in the silence of space, and waited with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be, and no particular urgency about how long this took. And that patience, more than the mass readings, more than the weapons it was not showing, more than the precision of its entry, was the thing that settled into Vren's chest, like a stone settling to the bottom of deep water. He opened the channel again. Captain Cole, he said, what exactly is in this documentation you wish to present? Edmund Cole's voice came back, and in it was the particular quality of someone who has been waiting for exactly this question for a very long time. The full history of what the hegemony has done to 37 civilizations over the past 2,000 years, Admiral. Verified, sourced, and presented in a format that will hold up before any tribunal in the known galaxy. We have survivor testimony. We have your own internal records, which we obtained through methods I am happy to discuss separately. We have communications between hegemony administrative offices going back 1,800 years. Everything that was done, who ordered it, who carried it out, and what happened to the people it was done to. A pause. We are not here to bargain, Admiral. We are here to present a case. What happens after the case is presented is a matter for the entities with jurisdiction. We have taken the time to identify who those entities actually are, as opposed to who the hegemony has historically claimed they are. Those two lists are somewhat different. Vren did not turn off the channel this time. He made himself breathe at a normal rate, because he was on his bridge with his crew watching, and 31 years of command had taught him that the most important thing a commanding officer can do in the moment when everything changes is to appear as though he expected it. He had not expected this. Nothing in 31 years had prepared him for this, because nothing in the hegemony's history of 300 years had prepared anyone for this, because the hegemony had grown so large and remained unchallenged for so long, that the category of genuinely unexpected had quietly ceased to exist in anyone's operational planning. Until now. Until a ship that should not exist, built by a species that was supposed to be 40 years from mattering, sat in hegemony space, and calmly told a hegemony admiral that it had the receipts. Send your documentation, Vren said. Already transmitted, sir. It arrived in your fleet command's secure queue 9 minutes ago. We sent it before we opened communication with you. We wanted to be sure it was received regardless of how this conversation went. Vren looked at his communications officer. She was already checking. She nodded once. The documentation was there. Vren thought of his 7 fleet installations. He thought of their response times and their weapon capacities. He thought of the assessments and the projections and the comfortable 18-month-old intelligence file that had told him humans were not a factor in hegemony strategic planning. He looked at the enduring principle on his display. It still showed no weapons. He understood now that this was not a gap in the data. This was a choice, a deliberate, considered choice made by people who had built the most capable vessel he had ever encountered, and had then decided that they did not need to show him what it could do, because showing him was not the point, and had never been the point, and the fact that he was only now understanding this was itself part of what they were telling him. He stood up from his command chair. All stations, he said, stand down from active alert. We are moving to diplomatic protocols. The bridge was very quiet. And someone get me a direct line to Fleet Command, he said. They are going to want to talk to me, and I am going to need to tell them something I am fairly certain none of them are ready to hear. Fleet Command's response to Vren's report took 11 minutes to arrive, which was itself a message. Fleet Command had never taken 11 minutes to respond to a Priority 1 communication. The standard response time was under 90 seconds. The extra 9.5 minutes meant that whatever was happening on the other end of that channel, it was not simple. When the response came, it was not from the duty officer. It was from Grand Admiral Sarah Lawn herself, the highest military authority in the hegemony fleet. A woman who had not directly addressed a field commander since the Beleth campaign 4 years ago. "Vren," she said, "hold position. Do not engage. Do not respond to any further communication from the human vessel without clearance from this office. We are reading the documentation now." She cut the channel before he could respond. Vren stood on his bridge and looked at the enduring principle and held position, which was the entirety of what he was able to do. The documentation was 1,200 pages long. He knew this because his communications officer, Lieutenant Yael Cross, had pulled the header data from the copy sitting in his own secure queue. 1,200 pages, with appendices. The appendices alone were 400 pages. The source citations at the back filled 60 additional pages, and a brief scan showed that each citation linked to a verified original document, most of them from hegemony internal archives, the kind of files that were not supposed to exist outside of the hegemony's most protected administrative systems. "Sir," Cross said carefully, "the source citations, several of these are from classified hegemony archives at security levels above my clearance. Above your clearance. They should not be accessible to any external party." "And yet," Vren said, "and yet they are here, sir. Fully reproduced, intact, original formatting preserved." Vren did not respond to this. There was nothing useful he could say about it. The humans had accessed documents that should have been inaccessible. The question of how was important, but it was not the most urgent question. The most urgent question was what those documents contained. He found out 40 minutes later when Sarah Lawn opened the channel again. She did not look like herself. Vren had met Lawn in person twice in his career. She was a compact, precise woman, who gave the impression of having been engineered for the specific purpose of being unimpressed by things that impressed other people. She had survived 3 fleet engagements and 2 political purges within the hegemony's own command structure. She did not rattle. She looked rattled. "Vren," she said, "the High Council is convening. This will take time. Your orders are to maintain current position and continue diplomatic protocols. Under no circumstances are you to initiate any action against the human vessel." "Understood, Grand Admiral. Can you tell me what is in the documentation?" A pause. "Things," she said, "that should not have been put in writing." She ended the channel. Vren looked at the enduring principle for a long time after that. Edmund Cole had said nothing since the initial exchange. The human ship had transmitted its documentation and then fallen completely silent, not in a way that suggested uncertainty or waiting or any kind of anxiety about the response, but in a way that suggested a situation fully expected and prepared for, a silence comfortable in itself, the silence of a party that has made its statement and is content to let the statement do its work while they wait. Vren's senior officers moved around the bridge in the particular disciplined quiet of people who understand that something significant is happening and that their job right now is to perform their functions correctly and not ask the questions that are occurring to them. He was proud of them for this. He always had been. It was Piers Oak who finally came to stand beside him again, 3 hours into the silence. "Sir, we are receiving fleet movement data from the long-range sensors. Multiple hegemony vessels are repositioning. To intercept the human ship? No, sir. They are moving away from the human ship. The fleet installations at Brevkos and the 9th Sovereign platform are actually pulling back from their current positions. It looks like a defensive repositioning." Vren absorbed this. The hegemony fleet was moving away from the enduring principle, not toward it. The 7 installations he had cited to Edmund Cole as evidence of hegemony strength in this region were rearranging themselves in a pattern that looked less like preparation for engagement and more like preparation for something else entirely. He pulled up the strategic overlay. He looked at the repositioning vectors. They were moving to protect core hegemony systems, the inner worlds, the administrative centers, the places where things that mattered to the hegemony's continued existence were located. Someone at Fleet Command had read the documentation, or enough of it, and had made a decision about what category of situation this was. And the decision they had made was not the category that ended with the enduring principle being escorted out of hegemony space by a show of superior force. Sir, Oak said. The human vessel. It is transmitting again. Vren straightened. Put it through. Edmund Cole's voice filled the bridge, calm and without ceremony. Admiral Vren, I wanted to inform you that we have now transmitted the complete documentation package to the following parties. A list followed. Vren recognized most of the names. The Conclave of 12 Worlds, the Independent Trade Assembly, the Belith Neutral Compact, the Varathi Observer Council, every significant interstellar diplomatic body in the known galaxy, every party with any standing, to receive and act on what the documentation contained. We are transmitting to all of them simultaneously, using a broadcast method that cannot be recalled or intercepted once initiated. We wanted you to be aware that this has occurred. Vren said, You have already sent it. We sent it before we entered your space, Admiral. The transmission was on a delayed broadcast. It went out the moment we confirmed our arrival in this system. Vren looked at Oak. Oak looked at Vren. The documentation had not been a negotiating chip. It had never been a negotiating chip. It was a statement of fact that was now sitting in the secure archives of every significant diplomatic entity in the galaxy simultaneously, and there was no version of this conversation in which the hegemony could make it unsay what it said. Captain Cole, Vren said, because someone had to say something, and he was the one in the chair. What exactly is it that you want from this? The pause that followed was not a thinking pause. It was a considering whether to answer pause, which is a different thing. We want 3 things, Admiral. First, formal recognition of the sovereign rights of all 37 populations currently under non-consensual hegemony administration. Second, the immediate withdrawal of hegemony administrative and military presence from those 37 systems, on a timeline to be negotiated, but not to exceed 18 standard months. Third, access for independent observers to verify that the withdrawal has occurred and that the populations in question have been left in a condition to exercise self-determination. And if the hegemony does not agree, then we will stay here, Cole said simply. We will continue to make ourselves available for discussion. We will provide whatever assistance we are able to provide to the 37 populations, and we will make absolutely sure that every diplomatic body in the galaxy continues to have current, updated, verified information about the situation. We will do this for as long as it takes. You are one ship, Vren said. Yes, Cole said. One ship cannot compel the hegemony to do anything. A pause longer than the previous ones. Admiral, the hegemony has spent 2,000 years operating on the principle that the only way to change something large is to be something larger. We understand why you believe that, but we would ask you to consider the possibility that the size of the ship is not always the thing that determines the outcome of a situation. Sometimes the thing that matters is what the ship is carrying. Vren thought about 1,200 pages of documentation now sitting in the archives of every major diplomatic body in the galaxy. He thought about his 7 fleet installations repositioning to protect the inner worlds. He thought about Sarah Lon's face when she told him that things should not have been put in writing. I have to report this conversation to Fleet Command, he said. Of course, Cole said. We expected you would. We would ask you to tell them one more thing. What? Tell them that we checked. Every species in the documentation, every population the hegemony reclassified as extinct or integrated over the past 2,000 years. We found the survivors. Most of them. They are alive. They are well. They are watching this situation very closely, and many of them have already provided testimony to the Conclave's newly convened investigative body, which began its session 40 minutes ago. A pause. The hegemony has been very large for a very long time, Admiral. But large things are held together by the belief that they cannot be changed. When that belief changes, the thing changes with it. We are not here to destroy the hegemony. We are here to give the galaxy the information it needs to decide what the hegemony should become. That is a decision for many parties. Not just for us. Not just for you. Vren opened his mouth, closed it again. The documentation, he said finally. How long did it take to compile? 11 years, Cole said. 11 years. For what? The answer, when it came, was the quietest thing Edmund Cole had said in the entire conversation, and it was the thing Vren would think about for the rest of his life. Because someone had to, Cole said, and because we remembered what it felt like to be in the documentation instead of writing it. The channel was still open. Vren did not close it. He stood at his command display and looked at the enduring principle, and thought about a civilization that had spent 11 years building a case, and another unknown number of years building a ship, and had arrived in his space not with a demand, but with a history. A history that was now, as of 40 minutes ago, in the hands of every entity with the standing to act on it. His communications console chimed. Fleet Command again. He could see from the identifier that it was Lon herself. He accepted the channel. She did not look better than she had looked the last time. She looked like someone who had read something they could not unread, and was now dealing with the particular problem of not being able to unread it. Vren, the High Council has a response. What is it? She was quiet for a moment. In 31 years of service, Vren had never seen Sarah Lon be quiet before speaking. She was the kind of officer who always knew exactly what to say and said it. They want to negotiate, she said. They are willing to discuss terms. Vren looked at the enduring principle. He understood now. Not all of it. He would spend years understanding all of it. But the basic shape of it, the outline of what Edmund Cole had understood when he built this approach, and why it worked, and why it would continue to work, that outline was clear to him now. The hegemony was not capitulating because the enduring principle could defeat their fleet, though Vren had a private suspicion about that which he kept to himself. The hegemony was capitulating because the enduring principle had done something more difficult and more permanent than winning a battle. It had taken away the option of pretending. The documentation was out. The survivor testimony was in the Conclave's records. Every diplomatic body in the galaxy had the same information at the same time. There was no version of the next 10 years in which the hegemony could continue to operate the way it had operated for the past 2,000 years, because the thing that had allowed it to operate that way, the collective willingness to accept its account of itself, was gone. One ship had done that. Not by being the largest thing in the room, by knowing exactly what it was carrying, and putting it exactly where it could not be ignored. Tell the High Council, Vren said, that I will relay their willingness to negotiate, and tell them to be specific about terms. Captain Cole has been very specific. We should match that. Lon nodded. There was something in her face that he could not quite read, something that had not been there before today. Vren, do you understand what just happened? He looked at the enduring principle one more time. Yes, Grand Admiral, he said. I think I do. The ship sat in hegemony space in the silence of stars, and waited, and Vren understood that it would wait for exactly as long as it needed to, because the people inside it had made a decision about this a very long time ago, and the decision was not contingent on how quickly other people were ready to accept it. He opened the channel back to Cole. Captain, he said, the Hegemony High Council has expressed willingness to negotiate terms. We heard, Admiral, Cole said. We are ready whenever they are. You heard? We have been monitoring all fleet communications since we arrived. We did not hide this. It was in the initial capability disclosure we transmitted, along with the documentation. Item 47, on page 8. Vren made himself breathe at a normal rate. Of course it was, he said. The negotiation was not what any of them expected. Vren had been in negotiations before. They were, in his experience, exercises in controlled pressure. You assessed what the other party needed most and made them work for it, while surrendering as little as possible of what you needed most. And eventually, everyone arrived at a point where the cost of continuing to negotiate exceeded the cost of accepting whatever was on the table, and that was when you had a treaty. This was not that. Edmund Cole arrived at the negotiation with a tablet, 2 junior officers, and no apparent interest in the kind of positional maneuvering that Vren's entire career had prepared him for. He sat down at the table in the conference room aboard the HSS Dominion, which was the hegemony's choice, and therefore the hegemony's ground, and he put the tablet on the table and he said, Here are the terms. They are not a starting position. They are the minimum outcome that is consistent with the evidence in the documentation. We are happy to discuss implementation timeline and logistics. We are not in a position to discuss the terms themselves. The hegemony's lead negotiator, a senior diplomat named Counselor Adine Marsh, had been doing exactly this kind of work for 40 years. He had negotiated the terms of integration for 6 civilizations. He was very good at this. He looked at Cole's tablet, and he looked at Cole, and he prepared to do what he had done 40 years of practice doing. He failed. Not because Cole was aggressive. Cole was not aggressive. He was patient in the specific way of someone who has understood for a long time that the outcome is already determined, and the negotiation is a process of getting everyone else to understand this at a pace they can manage. Every time Marsh tried to move the boundary of what was being negotiated, Cole returned to the documentation, specifically, to the section of the documentation that was relevant to whatever Marsh was trying to renegotiate. He would reference the page number, summarize the relevant finding in one sentence, and then say, "Given that this is in the record, what would a reasonable adjustment to this term look like?" The answer, in every case, was that a reasonable adjustment looked like Cole's original term, because the documentation was very thorough and very clear, and left very little room for the argument that the hegemony's position was defensible in ways that would hold up in front of the conclave's investigative body, which had by now completed its first round of survivor testimony and was generating findings at a rate that suggested it was not going to run out of material anytime soon. Marsh called a recess after 6 hours. He found Vren in the corridor outside the conference room. "He has everything," Marsh said. He was not a man who was easily shaken. He looked shaken. "Yes," Vren said. "Not just the administrative records, the internal communications, the budget allocations for specific operations, the signed orders. He has the signed orders, Vren, from 3 centuries of operations, signed, authenticated, originals. I know. How? Those files are in systems with physical security. They should not be extractable by any remote method." Vren thought about this. He had thought about it since the moment Cross had told him the source citations in the documentation linked to hegemony classified archives at security levels above his clearance. "He told me they obtained the records through methods he was willing to discuss separately," Vren said. "I did not follow up on this." Marsh stared at him. "Because," Vren said carefully, "the methods they used to obtain the records is a smaller problem than what the records contain. And because I had a sense that the answer to how they got the records would produce a set of problems I was not ready to address, while also addressing everything else." Marsh absorbed this. He had 40 years of experience in hegemony diplomacy, and those 40 years had given him a very sophisticated sense for when a situation had moved outside the category he was equipped to handle. "What do we do?" he said. "We accept the terms," Vren said. "The High Council will resist." "The High Council can read the documentation," Vren said. "The same documentation that the Conclave, the Trade Assembly, the Neutral Compact, and the Observer Council are all currently reading. The documentation that includes, on page 417, the internal communications from 3 sitting High Council members authorizing specific operations in 7 of the 37 systems, by name, with dates." Marsh went quiet. "The choice," Vren said, "is not between accepting Cole's terms and not accepting them. The choice is between accepting them in a context where the hegemony participates in the process and shapes the implementation, or having them imposed by a tribunal that is convening regardless of whether we participate. Cole gave us the option to choose. That was why he came here first. Not because he needed our cooperation, because he gave us the chance to offer it." Marsh looked at the door to the conference room. "He knew we would be here," Marsh said quietly. Before he arrived, he knew what the hegemony's response would be. He built this entire approach around it. "Yes," Vren said. 11 years. Yes. Marsh was quiet for a long moment. "What is he?" Marsh said finally. "What kind of person spends 11 years building a case against a power 300 times the size of his own civilization, with no guarantee it will work, and then arrives with 1 ship and no threats, and just presents it?" Vren thought about that for a long time. "Someone," he said eventually, "who was very angry about something, for a very long time, and was also very patient, and eventually found a way to make both of those things useful at the same time." They went back into the conference room. Cole was sitting at the table in exactly the position he had been in when they left. He was not reviewing notes. He was not consulting with his junior officers. He was sitting quietly, with his hands flat on the table, looking at the far wall with the expression of someone whose mind is entirely elsewhere and is content to let it be. Marsh sat down. He looked at the tablet with Cole's terms on it. He looked at Cole. Implementation timeline, he said. We need to discuss implementation timeline. Cole nodded. He pulled the tablet toward him and found the relevant section. And the work began. It was not. Vren would later write in his official account, the conversation anyone on the hegemony side had prepared for. Cole negotiated implementation timeline with the patience of someone who had already won the argument about whether the implementation was going to happen, and was simply now working through the logistics of how. He was reasonable about sequencing. He was flexible about resource constraints the hegemony raised. He accepted 3 modifications to the monitoring mechanism that Marsh proposed, on the grounds that they made the verification process more rigorous, not less. He accepted nothing that would have reduced the substance of what the 37 populations would receive. At the end of the second day, Marsh proposed a modification that would have delayed full sovereignty recognition for 6 of the 37 systems by an additional 36 months, citing administrative complexity. Cole looked at the proposal for a moment. Then he turned to one of his junior officers and said something in a language Vren did not recognize. The junior officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Petra Holt, who had sat through 2 days of negotiations in nearly perfect silence, pulled up something on her own tablet and showed it to Cole. Cole looked at it. He turned back to Marsh. The 6 systems you are proposing to delay are the same 6 systems where the most serious violations occurred, according to the documentation. Specifically, they are the 6 systems where the survivor populations have been reduced the most significantly. The 36-month delay would mean those populations waited longer for recognition than the populations that experienced less severe situations. We do not think the evidence supports that outcome. Marsh started to respond. Cole continued. We understand the administrative argument. It is a real argument. So we would propose this instead. For those 6 systems specifically, we provide human administrative support personnel to assist with the transition process at no cost to the hegemony. We have people trained for this kind of work. They are already prepared to deploy. It eliminates the administrative complexity and allows the timeline to remain consistent across all 37 systems. A pause. We anticipated that these 6 systems might require additional support. We prepared for it before we arrived. Marsh looked at Cole. You brought support personnel for post-negotiation implementation, he said. With you, on the ship. On the ship, and in the 2 vessels traveling with us, that have been maintaining a position outside sensor range since we arrived. We did not disclose them because they are not military assets, and we did not want their presence to be misread. They are logistical and humanitarian support vessels. Vren looked at Oak. Oak had gone very still. 2 additional vessels, Vren said. Outside sensor range. Yes, Admiral. We disclosed this in the supplementary capability document. Page 14. We apologize if it was easy to miss. The document was quite long. The negotiations concluded on the morning of the 4th day, with a signed agreement that Vren would later describe to his grandchildren as the moment when he understood that being large was not the same thing as being strong, and that the difference between the two was a distinction that the hegemony had spent 2,000 years successfully avoiding and could not avoid any longer. He stood on the bridge of the HSS Dominion as the enduring principle prepared to break orbit, and he watched it on his display, and he thought about 11 years of work, and 1 ship, and 1,200 pages of documentation, and a human captain who had arrived in hegemony space, carrying nothing except the truth about what the hegemony had done, and the absolute certainty that the truth was enough. He had been right. It had been enough. The conclave investigative session was 40 days in when archivist Nessa Quillen arrived at the witness chamber and found a Vaesi elder sitting in the corridor outside it, waiting to testify. Quillen had been an archivist for the Conclave of 12 Worlds for 22 years. She had processed testimony from 416 witnesses in that time, across 7 formal investigative bodies and 2 tribunal proceedings. She knew what waiting looked like. She knew the particular body language of people who were about to say something important, and had been carrying it for a long time, and were ready to put it down. The Vaesi elder was not displaying any of that. She was sitting in a plain chair outside the chamber door with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes open, and she looked like someone who had been waiting not for this moment, but for the entire category of moment this was, and the waiting had happened so long ago that it had become just a fact about her. like height or the color of her eyes. The Vici were supposed to be mythology. Every xenoarchaeology course in the Conclave's educational system included a section on species that had achieved transcendence, the concept that some civilizations reached a state of development so advanced that they simply moved beyond the physical realm and into something the instruments of material science could not detect or describe. The Vici were the primary example. Their disappearance 2,000 years ago had been the foundational case study. The evidence of transcendence was the evidence of absence. They were gone, and the most satisfying explanation for where they had gone was upward. The woman in the corridor was approximately 80 years of age, by Quillen's estimation. She was small and quiet, and she was sitting in a plain chair, and she was not mythology. "I am Archivist Quillen," Quillen said. "I will be managing your testimony today. Can I get you anything before we begin?" The elder looked at her. Her eyes were very clear. "I have been prepared for this for 40 years, she said. "I do not need anything." They went in. The testimony took 6 hours. Quillen had prepared for a session of perhaps 90 minutes, based on the summary the elder had provided in her pre-testimony filing. The summary had been brief and modest in its apparent scope. The testimony itself was neither of those things. The elder spoke without notes. She had the names of every individual she referenced. She had dates. She had the names of hegemony administrative personnel, and the designations of the vessels they had arrived on, and the specific orders they had carried, and what those orders had produced. She spoke in the past tense about things that had happened 2,000 years ago, as though they had happened within living memory, which, Quillen understood by the third hour, was because for her people they effectively had. The Vici had maintained their history orally across 2,000 years in exactly the same way that the history of what had happened to them was maintained. Not written down, because writing could be found, but spoken, from one generation to the next, in a form that existed only inside people, and could therefore only be silenced by silencing every person who carried it. The hegemony had tried. It had not fully succeeded. The specific moment when Quillen understood the full scale of what she was processing came in the 5th hour, when the elder began naming the other species. Not the Vici alone. She named 11 other civilizations. She named the specific individuals among those civilizations who had helped the Vici hide. She named the places where they had hidden together, and the arrangements they had made, and the ways they had helped each other survive across 2,000 years in the dark between stars, passing information and resources along a network so careful and so slow that the hegemony's intelligence apparatus had never detected it because the network moved at the speed of generation ships with no active communications, which is a speed too slow to look like a network if you are looking for the kind of pattern a connected system makes. It had taken the humans to find it. Not because the humans were smarter than the hegemony, because the humans had been told where to look by the Vici themselves, through a contact that had taken 11 years to establish and had been initiated not by humanity, but by a Vici scout who had been watching human space since humans first achieved faster-than-light travel, and had decided, after careful observation, that these were people who might be trusted. "How did you decide?" Quillen asked. "How did you decide that humans were worth the risk of contact?" The elder considered this for a moment. "They were angry," she said. "Not at us. At the right things. We watched them for a long time, and we watched what made them angry, and it was the right things. The things that should make you angry. And they stayed angry. They did not get comfortable and stop. That is rare." She looked at Quillen steadily. "Every other civilization we observed eventually made a kind of peace with the existence of the hegemony. They found a way to coexist with it, to work within it or around it, to accept it as the large thing that you build your life in the shadow of, and do not directly challenge because the cost is too high. Humans had the same pressures, the same reasons to make that peace, and they did not make it. Why not? Because, the elder said, they had been the smaller thing once, very recently, not 2,000 years ago, within living memory for some of them. They remembered what it felt like to have no options, and they did not trust the feeling of safety that came from choosing not to challenge something that was hurting other people. They were suspicious of their own comfort. Quillen wrote this down. She wrote it down very carefully. The testimony ended in the early evening. The elder stood, collected the small bag she had brought with her, and walked toward the door. She stopped before she reached it. "The humans," she said. "Their captain, the one on the ship, Captain Cole, Quillen said. You should know something about him. Something that is not in any document. Quillen waited. He lost people, the elder said. Before this, before the documentation, before the 11 years, there was a hegemony administrative action in a system near human space that resulted in the death of a colony. A small one. Civilians. The hegemony classified it as a border incident of no diplomatic significance. It is on page 240 of the documentation. Quillen was quiet. He was there, the elder said. Not during the action. After it. He was a young officer on the relief vessel that arrived 11 days after the incident. He spent 3 weeks on that colony. He never spoke publicly about what he saw. But we know. We have watched him for a long time. And we know that the reason he spent 11 years building the documentation was not because someone assigned it to him. It was because he could not stop seeing what he had seen in those 3 weeks. And he spent 11 years finding a way to make it matter. She went through the door. Quillen sat in the empty witness chamber for a while after she left. The recording equipment was still running. She turned it off. Some things did not need to go into the formal record. Some things were just true in the way that certain facts are true, quietly and without needing to be argued. The conclave's investigative body issued its preliminary findings 6 weeks later. The findings were 280 pages long and referenced 1,100 source documents, most of them from the human documentation package, some of them from testimony given by survivor species representatives over the 6 weeks of formal sessions. The preliminary findings described the hegemony's conduct across 2,000 years in language that was precise and careful and entirely without mercy, because the findings were prepared by people who understood that precision and mercy were not the same thing, and that the facts of the documentation required precision and would not be served by softness. Quillen read them the night before they were formally published. She had been an archivist for 22 years. She had seen findings and rulings and tribunal decisions from half a dozen investigative bodies. She had a professional appreciation for the way institutional language worked, the way it contained things, the way it made the large things manageable by wrapping them in the grammar of formal process. The preliminary findings were not wrapped in anything. They said, in the specific clear language of people who had read everything and understood what they had read and were not willing to describe it as anything other than what it was, the hegemony had, over 2,000 years, systematically destroyed or suppressed 37 civilizations, had altered the records of those actions to prevent accountability, and had operated under the protection of an international diplomatic community that had chosen, for reasons of convenience and stability, not to ask the questions that would have produced this result much earlier. The last paragraph was one sentence. It read, "The evidence presented in this investigation was not hidden. It was available. It was not found for 2,000 years because no party with the capacity to find it considered it their problem to look." Quillen thought about the Vesi elder in the corridor, sitting in a plain chair with her hands folded, waiting with the patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this for a very long time. She thought about Edmund Cole on a relief ship 11 days after a border incident that the hegemony had classified as no diplomatic significance, spending 3 weeks in what he found there, and then spending 11 years turning what he could not forget into something that could not be ignored. She submitted the testimony transcript for formal archiving and went home, and she sat in her own apartment in the late evening quiet, and she thought about the question the elder had answered. How did you decide that humans were worth trusting? They were angry at the right things, and they stayed angry. She thought about that for a long time. She thought it was perhaps the most honest description of a virtue she had ever heard, because anger at the right things, sustained and made patient and turned into work, was not something any civilization's official values documents listed as a virtue, but it was the thing that had just changed everything, and it was worth naming correctly. The next morning, the preliminary findings were published simultaneously to every diplomatic body in the known galaxy. The hegemony's response, which arrived 4 hours later, was a formal statement expressing willingness to cooperate with the investigation and openness to discussing the implementation of the terms already agreed with the human delegation. Quillen read the statement and thought about what it meant that the hegemony had chosen, in its response to findings this severe, to emphasize the terms already agreed rather than challenge the findings themselves. It meant that someone in the hegemony's leadership had understood something. The documentation was out. The testimony was recorded. The findings were published. There was no version of the future in which none of this had happened. The only available question was what the hegemony was going to be in a future where all of this was permanently in the record. And the only way to have any influence over that question was to participate in answering it. One ship had created that situation. One ship, carrying 11 years of work and the quiet and absolute certainty of people who had decided long ago that being small was not the same as being powerless, and that being patient was not the same as being passive, and that the truth, if you assembled it carefully enough and delivered it to enough people at the same time, was the most precise instrument in the known universe. Quillen began preparing the formal archive entries for the investigation. There were thousands of documents to process and index and store, in the forms that would make them accessible to researchers and policymakers and future investigators for as long as the conclave maintained its records. She worked steadily and carefully, and without rushing because the work was important, and important work deserved that quality of attention. At some point in the middle of the afternoon she stopped and wrote one additional note, not in the formal archive but in her own working file, the personal document she had kept since her first day as an archivist, where she recorded the things that did not fit neatly into the official categories. She wrote, "Sometimes the largest thing in the room is not the largest thing in the room." She filed it and went back to the archive work. Outside, the enduring principle was already gone, folded back into the space between stars, heading home. It had done what it came to do. The rest of it, the tribunals and the transitions and the slow and difficult work of 37 populations, rebuilding what they had not been allowed to be, was human work in a different sense, the work that other species would have to do themselves, with support where they wanted it. The ship had given them the chance to do it. That was all it had ever meant to do. What Quillen did not know, because it was not in any document yet, was that the ship was not gone. The enduring principle had folded out of the system 3 days after the agreements were signed. Every tracking system in hegemony and conclave space had recorded its departure. Every official communication from the human delegation had confirmed that the mission was complete and the vessel was returning to Earth. This was true. It was not the complete truth. The complete truth was that 2 other vessels had been waiting in the dark outside sensor range since the day the enduring principle arrived. They had not been idle. While Cole was in the conference room with Vren and Marsh, while the conclave was convening its investigative body, while the preliminary findings were being drafted, these 2 vessels had been doing the slower and more detailed work that comes after the large thing has happened and before the larger thing can begin. The first vessel was a support and logistics ship. Its crew of 112 included specialists in post-conflict reconstruction, agricultural recovery, medical infrastructure deployment, and the particular discipline of helping populations that have been suppressed for very long periods of time begin the process of believing that the suppression has actually ended. This last specialty was rarer than the others, and harder. The physical infrastructure of a recovered society could be built with enough materials and enough time. The internal infrastructure, the collective sense that safety was real and permanent and not a temporary condition that would be revoked when it became inconvenient for someone larger, that was a different kind of work. It took longer. It required people who understood what 2,000 years of systematic suppression did to a species' relationship with its own future. The humans had brought those people. The vessel's commanding officer was a woman named Captain Grace Arden, who had spent 20 years of her career doing this specific kind of work in human space before the mission had found her. She was methodical in a way that looked, to people who did not know her, like slowness. It was not slowness. It was the precise pace required for the work she was doing. You could not rush it without ruining it. Arden made first contact with 7 of the 37 populations before the enduring principle had even cleared the system. She did not announce herself as human. She announced herself as a representative of a support mission, and she sent the announcement in the specific frequency and encoding that the VASI network had told the human team the survivor populations used when they needed to communicate with parties they tentatively trusted. Some of them responded immediately. Some took days. One took 3 weeks, and when it finally responded, the response was a single line in a language Arden's translator had to work to process. a language that had not been heard outside its native system in 400 years. The line translated as, "Are you real?" Arden thought about this for a moment. Then she responded, "Yes, we are real. We are not going away. You do not have to decide about us immediately. We will be here." The second vessel was smaller and faster, and it carried a different kind of crew for a different kind of work. This was the intelligence and investigation team, the people who had spent 11 years building the original documentation and had not stopped when the documentation was delivered. Their work was finding the 17 additional populations that the original documentation had identified as existing somewhere, but had not yet been able to locate with enough precision to include in the main archive. They were not in obvious places. The hegemony's reach over 2,000 years had been thorough, and the populations that had survived it were the ones who had been most careful, in the most remote locations, with the most complete silences. Finding them required the same approach that had found the original 37, but applied to a set of targets that had spent centuries specifically avoiding the methods that had found the first group. The lead investigator on this vessel was a man named Senior Analyst Ben Quill, 43 years old, who had been on the documentation team since the 5th year and who had developed the specific detection methodology that had located most of the original 37 populations. He was not the kind of person who gave speeches. He was not the kind of person who was comfortable in the formal settings where Cole operated. He was very comfortable in small ships in remote corners of space, running detection algorithms and following evidence trails that other people had decided were too faint to be worth pursuing. He was following 17 evidence trails right now, simultaneously, and doing it with the focused and slightly obsessive quality of someone who has found the thing they are best at and has no interest in doing anything else. Quillen did not know any of this when she wrote her note and filed her archive entries and thought about the ship being gone. She found out 6 months later, when the first formal report from the support mission arrived in the Conclave's archive. It was accompanied by a brief transmission from Captain Arden, addressed to the Conclave's archival division. "We are sending you records," the transmission said. "Not for the investigation. The investigation is complete. These records are from the populations themselves. Their own accounts of their own histories, in their own words, in their own formats, preserved by them across 2,000 years of hiding, and now being shared, because they have chosen to share them. We are not editing them. We are not summarizing them. We are sending them as received. The archive should have them. People should be able to read them. These are not cases in a tribunal. These are people. Their stories belong in a place that keeps things." The records filled 340 volumes. Quillen processed them over the following year. It was the most significant work of her career, and she understood that while she was doing it, she processed each submission carefully and with the complete attention it deserved, and she created the index entries that would make each one findable by researchers for as long as the archive existed. When she was finished, she updated the note in her working file. She added a line below the one she had written before. The new line said, "The largest thing they carried was not the documentation. It was the belief that the stories of small things are worth keeping." She thought that was right. She closed the file and went home. In a remote corner of a star system with no strategic value and no resource deposits worth noting, Ben Quill's detection algorithm produced a positive signal. He looked at it for a moment, ran the verification sequence, and looked at it again. He opened a channel to his team leader. "I have one," he said. "Which number?" 14. "The population we flagged from the genetic trace in the 3rd appendix. They are there. I have a precise location." A pause on the other end. "How many?" the team leader asked. Quill looked at the numbers. He had learned in this work not to let the numbers hit him all at once, because the work required clarity, and clarity required not drowning in the weight of what the numbers meant. He had learned to process them in parts. He processed them in parts. "Enough," he said. "There are enough of them." The team leader was quiet for a moment. "Send the coordinates to Arden's vessel," she said. "Then rest. We go in tomorrow." Quill sent the coordinates. He did not rest. He was not capable of resting at this particular moment. He sat at his station in the small ship in the quiet of a system that had no name in any hegemony record, and he thought about the fact that there were people down there who did not yet know that something had changed. They would know soon. He thought about the Vaesi elder's testimony. which he had read as part of the documentation work. She had said that the humans had been trusted because they were angry at the right things, and stayed angry. He thought about the colony relief mission where Cole had spent 3 weeks. He had been on that mission too. Different ship, but the same operation. He had been 26 years old. He had spent 3 weeks and come home with the same thing Cole had come home with. And he had carried it for the same 11 years. And it had made him into exactly this person sitting in this small ship in a remote dark system, having just found the 14th of 17 hidden populations, because he had not been able to think about anything else for over a decade. He thought that was probably enough. He thought the anger, turned into patience, turned into work, turned into this, was enough. He opened the detailed scan of the system and began preparing the approach plan, careful and methodical, exactly right for the speed this kind of thing required. He had nowhere else he needed to be. 3 years after the enduring principle arrived in hegemony space, the tribunal convened. Not the conclave's investigative body, which had completed its work 14 months earlier and produced findings that were now required reading in the academic institutions of every major civilization in the known galaxy. Not the preliminary proceedings or the informal diplomatic summits that had filled the intervening period with the specific noise of many powerful parties, trying to determine what kind of process would produce the outcome they individually preferred. This was the full tribunal, formal, jurisdictionally clear, drawn from 7 bodies, including 4 that had never previously sat jointly on any proceeding, because the scale of what was being addressed exceeded the mandate of any single institution. Senior Counselor Vale Thur, of the Conclave of 12 Worlds, was assigned as the lead coordinating officer for the proceedings. This was not, his supervisor had explained when assigning him, because he was the most senior person available. It was because he had been the first Conclave official to have direct contact with the human delegation, and the tribunal's coordinating committee had decided that continuity of institutional knowledge mattered more in this case than rank. Vale Thur had accepted the assignment without comment. He was 63 years old and had been in conclave diplomatic service for 38 years, and he had come to believe, in those years, that most things in his field were variations on a small number of fundamental situations that repeated themselves across different species and different centuries, but contained, at their core, the same handful of conflicts. Power seeking to maintain itself, smaller parties seeking to renegotiate their position, the tension between the stability that large institutions provided and the costs that stability imposed on the parties least able to pay those costs. He had believed this until the day the enduring principle arrived. He still believed it, mostly, but he had added something to it. He had added the category of the thing that does not fit the small number of situations, the thing that comes along rarely, perhaps once in a generation, perhaps once in a century, that is not a variation on what has come before but is genuinely new. Not new in its surface details but new in its fundamental structure. A situation that does not resolve along the lines that similar situations have resolved along, because it is not actually similar to those situations, and the similarity was only visible from a distance, before you understood what you were actually looking at. The enduring principle situation was that thing. He was still working out exactly what it was. The tribunal's first session was procedural. 7 presiding officers from 7 bodies, establishing the joint jurisdiction framework, and agreeing on the rules of evidence and testimony. This took 3 days. Vale Thur managed the 3 days with the patience his years had given him, and the particular alertness he had developed since the first contact, the alertness of someone who has learned that the thing you were not expecting usually arrives when you are focused on something else. The hegemony's legal delegation arrived on the 2nd day. Vale Thur had met the delegation's lead counsel before, briefly, at the preliminary negotiations 14 months ago. His name was Counselor Dane Morrow, and he was exactly the person you would expect the hegemony to send to a proceeding like this. Experienced, technically excellent, and possessed of the particular kind of controlled expression that comes from years of practice at showing only what you choose to show. Morrow stopped Vale Thur in the corridor outside the main chamber on the afternoon of the 2nd day. "Counselor," he said, "I want to ask you something informally, before we are formally on the record." "Ask," Vale Thur said. "The humans, their captain and the delegation, are they here?" "Captain Cole is providing testimony in the 5th session," Vale Thur said. The documentation team will testify in sessions 4 through 7. The support mission leadership will testify in sessions 11 and 12. That is not what I asked, Morrow said. Vale-Thur looked at him. I asked if they are here, Morrow said. Not in sessions. I mean here, present, paying attention to this proceeding. Vale-Thur thought about this. Yes, he said. They are here. Morrow nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. My clients, he said carefully, would like to know whether the human delegation has any interest in participating in the remediation framework. Not the punitive elements. Those will run their course regardless. The remediation, the process of restoring the 37 populations to functioning autonomy. My clients understand that this process will require resources and expertise that the hegemony is not well positioned to provide independently, given the circumstances, and they understand that the humans have already demonstrated both. Vale-Thur was quiet for a moment. You are asking whether the humans would be willing to work with the hegemony on the remediation, he said. I am asking whether they have expressed any interest in doing so, Morrow said. We have not approached them directly. We were not certain it would be received well. Vale-Thur thought about Edmund Cole sitting across a negotiating table from Adine Marsh for 4 days, and not once raising his voice, and not once showing anything that could be read as anything other than calm and prepared, and completely committed to the outcome, without any particular interest in how the other party felt about being brought to it. I think, Vale-Thur said, that you should ask them directly. My impression is that Captain Cole is more interested in outcomes than in how those outcomes are reached. Morrow absorbed this. He is not what I expected, Morrow said. He rarely is, Vale-Thur said. In my experience, which is now over 3 years of intermittent contact, he is consistently something slightly different from what you expect him to be. Not dramatically different, just slightly. Enough that you have to keep adjusting. He thought for a moment. I think that is deliberate, he added. I think he has found that being slightly different from what people expect is a useful position to occupy. Morrow looked like he wanted to say something, and was deciding not to. Then he said it anyway. Did you ever ask him why he did this? Not the official explanation. The real one. Vale-Thur had been asked this question many times in the past 3 years. He gave the answer he had settled on, which was the most accurate one he had found. He told me once that someone had to, and they had the ship. I believe that is the true answer. I also believe it is not the complete answer. The complete answer involves a colony relief mission, 23 years ago, and 3 weeks, that he has never described publicly, and presumably never will. But the answer he gives is not inaccurate. It is just the part of the answer that is his to give. Morrow was quiet. A border incident, he said. I know the one you mean. My client's records show it as a minor administrative action with no surviving civilian presence. The human relief team's records, Vale-Thur said carefully, show it differently. Yes, Morrow said. I know. I read the documentation. He looked at the corridor wall for a moment. Then he looked back at Vale-Thur. All of it, he said. I read all 1,200 pages. Vale-Thur waited. There is a section, Morrow said, near the end, about the 9th administrative action in System 744. What the relief team found there. I know the section. It is 11 pages long, Morrow said. The rest of the documentation is very controlled in its language, precise and neutral, the kind of language that makes it impossible to argue with, because there is no emotional content for the opposing party to attack. That section is different. It reads differently from the rest. Vale-Thur said nothing. It reads like it was written by someone who was there, Morrow said. Yes, Vale-Thur said. I believe it was. Morrow looked at him for a long moment. Then he straightened his jacket and prepared to go back into the chamber. I will approach Cole directly about the remediation question, he said, as you suggest. I think that is wise, Vale-Thur said. The tribunal's substantive sessions began on the 4th day. Vale-Thur managed the proceedings from the coordinating officer's position, which was to the left of the main presiding bench, close enough to the action to see everything clearly, and far enough from it to maintain the neutral position his role required. He watched Cole testify in the 5th session. Cole had been testifying in formal settings for 3 years at that point. He was very good at it, He answered questions directly and fully, without elaboration beyond what the question required, and he was consistent across the 3 days of his testimony in a way that could not be manufactured by preparation alone. The consistency was the consistency of someone who is telling what actually happened, which, in Vale Thur's experience, is much harder to manufacture than people who have not done it professionally tend to assume. The hegemony's legal team tried to challenge the methodology of the documentation in the 7th session. They had prepared a detailed technical critique of the evidence-gathering process, suggesting that some of the source documents had been obtained in ways that compromised their admissibility. Ben Quill testified for an entire day in response. Quill was not a polished witness. He was the kind of person who became visibly uncomfortable when required to speak about himself, and visibly absorbed when allowed to talk about the work. He had brought with him the complete methodology documentation, which ran to 600 additional pages, and had been prepared, he explained, specifically for the tribunal, because he had anticipated this line of challenge. He described the methodology in technical detail that was very precise, and occasionally very difficult to follow, and the hegemony's legal team raised 17 specific objections over the course of the day. Quill answered each one with a reference to a specific section of the methodology documentation, where the relevant decision had been made, and the reasoning documented. He had built the methodology to withstand exactly this kind of scrutiny, not because he had known there would be a tribunal, but because he was the kind of person who built things to withstand scrutiny, regardless of whether there was a specific challenge in prospect. By the end of the day, the hegemony's technical challenge to the documentation had produced 0 sustained objections. The presiding officer thanked Quill for his testimony. Quill looked relieved to be finished and went back to his seat and looked at his tablet, and Vale Thur had the strong impression that he was already thinking about the 3 remaining populations from the original list of 17 that Quill's team had not yet located. 2 months into the tribunal, something happened that Vale Thur had not anticipated and did not know how to categorize. 4 junior hegemony officials came forward voluntarily, not compelled, not in response to any specific subpoena. They arrived through their own legal counsel and requested the opportunity to provide testimony, and when the tribunal asked what testimony they wished to provide, the answer was testimony about what they had personally observed during their service in the 37 systems. Not testimony for the hegemony's defense, testimony consistent with the documentation, testimony that confirmed and in several cases expanded on what the documentation had already established. Vale Thur processed this information and sat with it for a while before he understood what it meant. It meant that even inside the hegemony, the position that the documentation was exaggerated or inaccurate was not tenable. Even people who had been part of the hegemony's administrative structure, who had careers and positions and every institutional incentive to defend the institution, had read the documentation and had not been able to maintain the comfortable distance between what the document said and what they knew to be true. The documentation had done something that formal accusations rarely did. It had made pretending impossible, not just for the parties outside the hegemony looking in, but for the people inside it. The 4 officials testified over 3 days. Their testimony was quiet and specific, and delivered in the careful manner of people who have made a decision that they know has consequences, and are committed to it anyway, and are not particularly interested in dramatic framing. After the 3rd day of that testimony, Morrow approached Cole directly. Vale Thur was not present for the conversation, but received a summary from Cole afterward. Morrow had asked about the remediation framework directly, as he had said he would. Cole had listened without interrupting. When Morrow finished, Cole had said, "Yes. We are prepared to assist with the remediation. We have already been assisting for 14 months. It seemed likely that the formal process would reach this point eventually, so we started early." Morrow had asked if this had been approved by Earth's government. Cole had said yes. It had been approved before the enduring principle departed. Morrow had asked whether the assistance was conditional on anything. Cole had said no, it was not conditional. The assistance was for the 37 populations, who needed it regardless of what any tribunal decided, and conditioning it on tribunal outcomes would have meant withholding support from people who needed it now, to apply pressure on a process that was going to happen at its own pace anyway. The humans had decided that was not how they wanted to operate. Morrow had been quiet for a moment. Then he had asked how many people the humans had deployed to the remediation work so far. Cole had said 412. across the 2 support vessels and several smaller deployed teams, with another 200 preparing to deploy within the next 6 months. Morrow had looked at Cole for a long time. Then he had said, "The hegemony is willing to contribute significant resources to the remediation if the framework is established, administrative personnel, infrastructure, logistics. We want to participate in this. Not to mitigate the tribunal findings. Those will be what they will be. We want to participate because the work should happen, and we have the capacity to assist with it, and we understand that standing aside from the work at this point is not a position that makes sense in light of everything that has been established." Cole had said he would need to discuss it with the relevant populations, not with the tribunal, with the populations themselves. Their cooperation in the hegemony's involvement was not something he had the authority to offer. That authority belonged to them. Morrow had agreed to this. Vale Thur read Cole's summary of the conversation, and then he sat in his office and looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote one line in his private journal, which he had been keeping since the first contact. He wrote, "The ship did not end 1,000 empires. The ship ended the argument that nothing could. The tribunal's final session took place on a Thursday." Vale Thur noted the day of the week in his journal, because the conclave did not typically use the human week as a time unit, and the fact that he had started using it was something he had noticed about himself with mild interest, the way you notice small changes in your own habits without being entirely sure when they started. The final session produced the ruling. 7 presiding officers had deliberated for 3 weeks. The ruling was 400 pages long. The summary was 12 pages. Vale Thur had read the full 400 pages and could have described the content of each section, but what he found himself thinking about during the formal reading of the summary was not the content, but the structure. The ruling was structured as 3 parts. The first part established what had happened, drawing on the documentation and the testimony and the investigative findings to create the authoritative record. The second part established accountability, naming specific parties and specific actions and specific periods of time and attaching formal determinations to each. The third part established what was going to happen next, the remediation framework, the monitoring mechanisms, the timeline for the withdrawal of hegemony administrative presence from the 37 systems, and its replacement with the administrative structures the populations themselves were building. The structure was unusual. Most rulings of this type focused heavily on the first 2 parts and treated the third as secondary. This ruling spent nearly as many pages on the third part as on the first 2 combined. When Vale Thur asked the lead presiding officer why, the answer was simple. Because the first 2 parts describe what went wrong, the presiding officer said. The third part is the only part that can do anything about it. Rulings that describe the wrong thing at great length and then give the remedy a paragraph tend to produce proceedings that feel complete, but situations that do not change. We decided we did not want to do that. Vale Thur wrote that down too. After the ruling was formally read into the record, the chamber cleared gradually, in the way that formal chambers clear. The presiding officers first, then the official delegations, then the observers and the journalists, and the researchers who had been present throughout, and who now began the process of digesting what they had witnessed and turning it into the various forms in which it would enter the broader record. Cole was one of the last to leave. He was standing near the back of the chamber talking to Ben Quill, and Vale Thur watched him from the coordinating officer's position without approaching, because the conversation looked like it was something. Quill said something and Cole nodded. Then Cole said something, and Quill looked at his tablet, and then back at Cole. Then Quill said something else, and Cole put his hand briefly on the younger man's shoulder, once, and then let it go. Quill nodded. He looked, from where Vale Thur was standing, like someone who had just been told something he had been waiting to hear. Vale Thur found out later from the mission communications log, which he had access to in his coordinating role, what the conversation had been about. Quill had found the last 3 populations. All 3 of the remaining 17, located over the previous 8 weeks, confirmed within the past 6 days. The full list of populations documented in the original archive was now complete. Every species the documentation had identified as potentially surviving was located and contacted and in communication with Arden's support mission. 17 for 17. The work that had started 11 years before the enduring principle ever entered hegemony space was done. That evening, Vale Thur sat in his quarters on the station and wrote the longest entry his journal had ever contained. He wrote for 2 hours. He wrote about the first contact and the ship and the documentation and the negotiations and the investigative sessions and the tribunal. He wrote about Admiral Vren's face when he realized what was in the documentation. He wrote about the Vaesi elder in the corridor with her hands folded. He wrote about Nessa Quillen's note, which had been shared informally through the archival network, and which he thought was one of the most accurate single sentences he had encountered in the entire proceeding. He wrote about Cole and Quill in the corner of the chamber, and what he had seen on Quill's face when Cole told him. Then he stopped, and he looked at what he had written, and he thought about what it added up to, and what it was actually about. It was about a colony relief mission 23 years ago. That was what it was actually about. Everything that had happened since, the 11 years and the documentation and the ship and the negotiations and the tribunal and the remediation and the 17 populations found in dark corners of space. All of it was the long continuation of something that started when a young officer named Edmund Cole arrived on a relief vessel 11 days after a border incident and spent 3 weeks with what he found there and came home unable to stop seeing it. That was the seed. Everything else was what happened when a seed fell on ground that was ready for it. Cole had the seed. The humans had ground ready for it. They were a species that could sustain that kind of anger, that specific and patient and directed anger, for the length of time it took to turn it into something with the precision and scale to matter. Not every species could do that. Most could not. Most either lost the anger quickly, replacing it with something more comfortable, or held it in a form that did not turn into work, that turned instead into bitterness, or grief, or the kind of loud and impotent protest that makes the person making it feel that they have done something without producing any actual change in the situation. The humans had held it correctly. He did not know if this was a character trait, something in the species, or if it was specific to the particular people who had ended up in this particular mission because of this particular seed. He suspected it was some of both. He suspected that the mission had attracted the people who could do what the mission required, and that those people existed in human society in the numbers they existed in because of something about the society that produced them. He wrote all of this down. Then he closed the journal. He had one more thing to do. He had been offered, 6 months ago, the position of conclave representative to the Transition Oversight Council, which was the new body that would manage the formal transition process for the 37 populations over the next 5 to 10 years. He had not accepted it yet. He had been thinking about it. He accepted it tonight, by sending the formal notification to the appointments office. He was 63 years old. He had been in diplomatic service for 38 years. The Transition Oversight Council work would take another 5 to 10, at minimum. He would likely be retired from active service before the last of the 37 transitions was complete. He had accepted the appointment anyway, because he was the person who had been there at the beginning and understood the beginning in the way that only being there at the beginning allows you to understand it, and that continuity of understanding was worth something to the populations who were going to be living through the next decade. Also, he thought, because there was a version of him from 5 years ago who would have assessed this situation and concluded that patience and careful institutional management were the appropriate response, and he would have been wrong, and the fact that he knew he would have been wrong was itself a kind of debt he felt he owed. Not to the humans, to the species that had been in the documentation, to the Vaesi elder in the corridor who had waited 2,000 years to say the word finally and had said it in a plain chair in a conference room, to a conclave archivist who had shown up, at the end of a very long chain of events, to listen. He would do the work. He went to sleep. Tomorrow was the first official day of the Transition Oversight Council's operating period. There were 37 populations beginning the process of rebuilding what they had not been allowed to be, and there was a support mission already 2 years into the ground-level work of helping them do it, and there were 2 vessels still out there finding the small dark corners, where surviving things wait for someone to notice them. He went to sleep thinking about what Arden had said in the transmission she sent with the 340 volumes of testimony. These are people. Their stories belong in a place that keeps things. He thought that was the most important sentence in the entire record. He went to sleep and the station turned slowly in its orbit, and somewhere, a long way away, the enduring principle was already being refitted for its next mission, and another ship was already being built. And the humans who were building it the same way they built the first one, fast and under pressure, and welded by hand in long, careful seams that would hold. 5 years after the tribunal, the last hegemony administrative vessel departed System 744, and the system's indigenous population hoisted, for the first time in 400 years, a flag of their own design over the central administrative structure. There were no cameras present. This was intentional. The population of System 744 had explicitly requested that the moment not be documented by anyone outside their community. They wanted to do it for themselves, in their own way, without the weight of observers who would transform the moment into content for the rest of the galaxy to process and discuss. Captain Grace Arden knew about it only because her contact within the community, a woman named Lisselle who had been one of the first people to respond to Arden's initial transmission 5 years ago, sent her a brief message 3 days later. The message had no words. It was a photograph of the flag. Arden looked at it for a while. Then she saved it to her personal archive and went back to work. The support mission was in its 6th year of operation. The crew had changed substantially from the original group. Some had rotated back to Earth. Some had asked to stay and had been permitted to stay. New people had arrived to fill the gaps, and they had to learn what the original crew knew, which took time, and the time it took was sometimes frustrating, and Arden managed the frustration, because frustration was a normal part of work, and normal parts of work were not crises. They were just the texture of ongoing effort. 32 of the 37 transitions were complete. 2 were in late-stage process. 3 were complicated. The 3 complicated ones were complicated for different reasons, and Arden had learned enough in 6 years to know that complicated was not a state of failure. Complicated was a state of accurate assessment. If a transition appeared simple from the outside, it usually meant that someone was not looking closely enough. The simplicity was a presentation, a surface condition, and the actual condition underneath it was complicated in ways that would surface later, if not attended to now. She attended to the complicated ones. She was sitting in her briefing room on the morning of the 6-year mark, reviewing the status reports from the 3 teams working in the complicated systems, when her communications console showed an incoming signal from Earth. Not Fleet Command, not the Mission Authority. The personal identifier for Edmund Cole. She accepted it. He looked older than the last time she had seen him, which was 18 months ago at a mission review in Conclave Space. 6 years of this work aged people in specific ways. The ways it had aged Cole were mostly visible in the area around his eyes, which had the settled quality of someone who has arrived somewhere they intended to arrive and is going to stay there. "Grace," he said. 6 years. 6 years, she confirmed. "I saw the report on 744. The last hegemony vessel cleared 48 hours ago. The flag was 3 days after that. Liesel sent me the photograph too," he said. Arden was quiet for a moment. "Did she send it to everyone?" "I think she sent it to the people she wanted to have it," Cole said. "Not everyone. Some people." They were both quiet for a moment, looking at each other across the transmission distance. "The last 3, Arden said. "You saw the status reports." "Yes. The 3rd one is the hard one, the one in the outer system, the population there. They are not ready to move to formal autonomous administration. They are not there yet. It might be another 2 or 3 years." "I know," Cole said. "That is not a timeline problem. That is just what it takes." "The Oversight Council is asking about the timeline." "I know," he said again. "I spoke with Vale Thur last week. He is managing it. He understands that timelines for this kind of work are not the same as timelines for institutional proceedings. He is better at that than he used to be." Arden thought about Vale Thur. She had met him once, briefly, at a transition review 2 years ago. He was not what she had expected from Cole's description of him. Cole had described him as a careful and traditional diplomat who had changed significantly since the first contact. What she had found was a person who was careful in a different way than she would have expected. Careful with the listening end, rather than the speaking end, which was not usually the end that senior conclave officials prioritized. "He is all right," she said. "He is," Cole said. "He is something that is rarer than it should be, someone who had a fixed idea and let it be changed by evidence." He looked at her through the transmission. "You should know something," he said. "Ben found the last one." Arden straightened. "When?" 3 days ago. It was the one we thought was in the outer null region." He was right. They are there. Small population, but intact, healthy, and very careful. How careful? Careful enough that Ben has been following their trace for 2 years and only closed the final distance 3 days ago. He said the approach took 6 hours because he did not want to move faster than they were comfortable with. 6 hours. He sat in the dark at the edge of their sensor range for 6 hours until they sent him a signal. He did not move until they invited him. Arden thought about this. Ben Quill, sitting in a small ship in the dark at the edge of a sensor range, in a remote corner of a system with no strategic value, waiting for people who had been waiting to be found for longer than he had been alive, waiting without impatience, without pressure. 6 hours. That is why he is good at this, she said. Yes, Cole said. That is exactly why. They were quiet again. Outside the window of her briefing room, Arden could see the support vessel's secondary shuttle bay, where 3 of her crew were working on a maintenance task that she had checked on earlier, and that was proceeding correctly. Beyond that, through the viewing port at the far end of the bay, the stars. I need to ask you something, Cole said. Ask. The mission's current authorization runs another 18 months. The Oversight Council is reviewing the extension request. They are going to approve it. But the scope of the extension is being discussed, and there is a question on the table that I have been asked to put to you directly. Arden waited. The extension would expand the mission's mandate to include the 17 populations that Ben's team located, not just the original 37. All of them. Same scope of support, same timeline flexibility, same operational approach, but larger. It would mean requesting additional resources, additional personnel, and potentially a 3rd vessel. You are asking if I can manage that scope, Arden said. I am asking what you think, he said. Not whether you can manage it. You can manage it. I am asking whether you think we should. This was, Arden recognized, a different question. Should was a different category of question than can. Can was operational. Should was about whether the thing was the right thing to do. She thought about it carefully. The 17 populations are in different conditions from the original 37, she said. They were hiding longer in most cases. The ones Ben found in the outer null, the outer systems, they have been in hiding for generations in some cases. The kind of support they need is not the same. It is slower, more careful, and it cannot be rushed, because rushing it would be the same kind of disrespect as not doing it. Yes, Cole said. So yes, she said, we should, but we should do it on the same terms we have done everything else, at the pace the populations can manage, not at the pace that looks impressive on an oversight report. I will tell the council that, Cole said. Tell them it will take as long as it takes, she said. If they need a number, tell them a number. But tell them the number is an estimate, not a commitment. And the commitment is to the work, not the schedule. He looked at her through the transmission. I told them something like that already, he said. I wanted to hear you say it too. After he closed the channel, Arden sat for a while in her briefing room with the status reports in front of her, and the 3 complicated situations that she was going to spend today working through, and she thought about the question he had asked. Not can you manage it? What do you think? She had been leading this mission for 6 years. She had been doing this kind of work for 20 years before the mission. She had a very detailed understanding of what the work required, and what it took from the people who did it, and what the difference was between doing it well and doing it at a speed that produced reports that looked good, but situations that quietly got worse. She thought that the question of should was actually a question about what the humans were doing here, what they had decided they were, what they were trying to be in the galaxy they had arrived in, with 1 ship and 1,200 pages of documentation 6 years ago. They were trying to be the kind of species that, when it had the capacity to help, helped, without conditions, without a timeline that suited the helpers more than the helped, without turning the help into something that served the helpers' interests under the packaging of service. That was what they were trying to be. It was hard. It required constant attention to the difference between what looked like help and what actually was. It required people like Ben Quill sitting in the dark for 6 hours, because moving faster would have been for his comfort, not for the population he was trying to reach. It required the discipline of Arden's own team, which had turned over 4 times in 6 years and had managed, every time a new person came in, to preserve the culture that the original crew had built, the culture of working at the speed the work required, rather than the speed that produced the best-looking reports. It was the hardest kind of discipline there was, because it never felt complete, and it never had a clear endpoint, and it constantly required choosing the less impressive option in favor of the more correct one. She thought they were doing it. Mostly. Not perfectly. Nothing was done perfectly, but mostly, and consistently, and with the kind of intention that made the imperfections correctable, rather than structural. She picked up the first of the 3 complicated status reports and started reading. 2 days later, she received a second message from Liesel. This one had words. The words were, "There are children here who have never been afraid of the sky. The first ones. We thought you should know." Arden read this several times. Then she added it to her personal archive, directly beneath the photograph of the flag. She thought about what it meant to be the first generation of a population that did not carry the weight of what previous generations had carried. What it meant to grow up in a world where the sky was just the sky, and not something to hide from. She thought that this was the thing the documentation and the tribunal and the oversight council and the remediation framework and all the formal architecture of the past 6 years had been working toward, and that it was also the thing that none of those formal structures could fully create on its own, and that the gap between what the formal structures could do and these children who were not afraid of the sky, was the gap that the work of her mission was trying to fill. She went back to the status reports. 3 months later, the second complicated transition completed on schedule. The third, the hard one in the outer system, sent a formal request for a transition review meeting, which was a step that indicated readiness to begin the formal process, even if the final completion was still some time away. Arden scheduled the meeting and sent a notification to Vale Thur's office on the Oversight Council, because he tracked every transition milestone personally, and had asked to be informed directly rather than receiving it in the general report. His response came back in 40 minutes. It was brief. It said, "Thank you. I will tell the council that we are on course. Not that we are ahead of schedule, or behind schedule. On course. That is the accurate phrase." Arden smiled at this. She thought that was not something the Vale Thur of 6 years ago would have written, that Vale Thur would have asked for a projected completion date and framed it against the original timeline. This one just wanted the accurate phrase. She thought that was growth, in the specific sense that mattered. Not growth toward something impressive, growth toward something correct. She sent back a 1-line reply. "On course is exactly right," she said. "That is all we ever meant to be." She put her tablet down and looked out at the stars, and somewhere out there Ben Quill was in a small ship heading toward a population that had been hidden long enough that the hiding was the only life they had known, and he was going at the speed they could manage, not the speed that impressed anyone, and that was the right speed, and the right speed was what this had always been about. The enduring principle was back in service, fully refitted, a new mission, different in its specifics from the first one, but identical in its fundamental character. Going to the places where the truth needed to be present, and bringing it there, carefully, with documentation so thorough it could not be argued away. A third ship was under construction, larger than the second, still welded, still fast, still built by people who needed it to exist more than they needed it to be beautiful. It would be called the Enduring Principle the Third, because humans named things with the confidence of people who had already decided what those names would mean. Arden had seen a photograph of the hull under construction, sent by someone on the build team who knew she would want to see it. The photograph showed the welds, long and careful and even, running in lines down the side of the hull like the work of someone who was very good at this, and knew exactly how much it mattered. She had looked at the photograph for a while. She had thought, here we go again. She had thought that this was the best possible thing to be able to think. What the galaxy had expected, when the story of the Enduring Principle began to circulate in full, was a narrative about military power, about a species that had been underestimated and had arrived to correct that underestimation in the most dramatic and visible way possible. Every species in the known galaxy had a version of this story in its own history, the small thing that turned out to be large, the weapon that was not a weapon until it was, the civilizational pivot that arrived from an unexpected direction. The Enduring Principle story had those elements. The ship was real. The capability was real. The engagement with the 9 hegemony destroyers was documented and analyzed and taught in military academies across 16 civilizations within 3 years of its occurrence. But the story that endured, the one that became the reference point, the one that scholars and diplomats and ordinary people returned to across the years, was not the engagement. It was the documentation. 1,200 pages, 11 years, one captain and one analyst, and a team of people who had decided that the truth, if assembled carefully enough, was more powerful than any weapon, and had spent over a decade proving it. The documentation became, within 5 years of its release, the most cited text in conclave academic history, not because of the specific findings, though those were significant, because of the method, because it showed that the path from wrong thing to corrected thing was not necessarily the path through force, that the path through evidence, assembled with enough precision and delivered to enough parties simultaneously, produced outcomes that force alone had never managed to produce. Force produced compliance. The documentation produced something harder and more durable. It produced a situation in which compliance was no longer the relevant category, because the frame within which non-compliance had been possible had been removed. You cannot negotiate with a frame that has been removed. You can only operate within the new one. This was the thing that military scholars had the hardest time with, and the thing that the diplomatic scholars found most interesting, and the thing that the populations of the 37 systems understood in their bones without needing to theorize about it. The hegemony did not change because it was defeated. It changed because it could no longer be what it had been. The structure of the thing had required the consent of everyone around it, the consent of the conclave and the trade assembly and the neutral compact, the consent expressed in silence and non-investigation, and the acceptance of convenient explanations. When that consent was withdrawn, not by force but by information, the structure no longer had what it needed to hold its shape. One ship had done that. Not by being the largest thing in the room, by being the most prepared. Arden thought about this sometimes, in the evenings, when the work of the day was done and she had time to sit with things. She thought about preparation in the specific sense that Cole had used it, the kind of preparation that took 11 years and required the kind of patience that most people could not sustain, and the kind of anger that most people could not keep usefully directed for that long. She thought about what it cost the people who did it. Not the mission cost, the personal cost. Ben Quill, who was 48 years old now, and had spent 17 years of his career finding people in dark places, had not returned to Earth in 4 years. He had taken leave 3 times, and used it to remain in the field, following evidence trails that his team would have handled adequately without him, but that he did not want to delegate, because he did not fully trust anyone else to do it, with the same quality of attention. Cole, who was 51, and had been carrying this since he was 26, and the relief mission to System 744, had a kind of settled quality now that Arden read as peace. Not the peace of completion, the peace of someone who has found the correct use for themselves and is in it. The work was not done. It would not be done in his lifetime, probably. But he was in the right place for the work, doing what the work required, and that was its own form of arrival. Vial Thur had told Arden, at the 2-year transition review where they had met briefly, that he had been afraid of the enduring principle when he first saw it. Not afraid that it would harm anyone, afraid of what it meant about how wrong he had been for how long. She had told him that being afraid of that was the correct response. He had thought about this for a moment, and then nodded. Yes, he had said. I think it was. I think it is what made it possible to do something about it. She thought about that conversation sometimes, about what it meant to be afraid of the right things. The Vaesi elder had said the humans were trusted because they were angry at the right things. Vael Thur had changed because he was afraid of the right things. These were not contradictory. Anger and fear, aimed correctly, were the same kind of signal. Something is wrong here. Pay attention. Do not look away. Most of the time, most beings looked away. Not because they were bad, not because they did not care. Because looking was hard, and staying with what you saw was harder, and turning what you saw into sustained action was the hardest thing of all, and the world was full of reasons to decide that someone else would do it, or that it was too large, or that the cost was too high, or that patience was the wisest response, and patience could safely become permanent. The humans had not looked away. She did not know if this was because of something specific about humans, or something specific about the particular humans who had ended up doing this work. She suspected it was both, and that neither was separate from the other. The work had found the people because the people existed, and the people existed because something in human civilization had created the conditions for them, and those conditions were not an accident. They were the result of a history that included, somewhere in it, the colony relief mission, and the specific 3 weeks that had produced Edmund Cole's particular and indelible understanding of what the hegemony was, seeds, and ground ready for them. The third ship was launched 11 months later. Arden watched the launch transmission from her briefing room. The ship looked, on the transmission, exactly like the Enduring Principle had looked in its launch footage, which she had watched many times. Large, dense, welded, built fast by people who needed it to exist. Named with the confidence of people who had already decided what the name would mean. The Enduring Principle, the third, cleared the orbital construction yard and oriented itself for its first fold space transit, and then it was gone, folded into the space between stars, heading somewhere that it had already calculated with the precision that only the human's navigation technology could achieve, toward a situation that needed to be addressed, and had not yet been addressed because no one with the capacity had yet decided it was their problem. Until now. Arden watched the empty space where the ship had been for a moment. Then she picked up the status report from the outer system, the last complicated transition, and she read the update from the field team, and she found that it was better than she had expected. Not complete, not simple. Better. She wrote the Oversight Council notification. She used Vale Thur's phrase. On course, she wrote. That is the accurate description. She sent it, and went back to the work. Because the work was ongoing, and the work was the point, and the work would continue, for as long as there were people willing to do it at the speed it required, which was not a fast speed, and was not an impressive speed, but was the correct speed, and the correct speed was the only one that got you to the right place. She thought about Liesel's message, the children who were not afraid of the sky. She thought that was what all of this had been, a long, slow, painstaking, difficult, never quite complete effort to make it so that somewhere, in some system that had spent too long in hiding, a child could look up at the sky and see just the sky. And that was worth the welding,